Okay. Let's get back. Let's get to let's get to the meat of what we want to talk about today. So I want to continue talking about this thing of absorption. So last class, we went through and we made a lot of headway on just understanding this absorption and the materials. And really, I mean, kind of what I want you to get out of this is, I don't know. I guess for me, when I've worked in acoustics enough, you start to get a feel for it. And I guess if you think about it and work with it long enough, you start to develop this like visualization and this intuitive feel. I mean, we all have this intuition about sound and absorption and that sort of thing, but now it's backed with a little bit of science. You can start to like approach a situation with some physics understanding on this stuff. So, last class, yeah, we talked about mostly like absorbing mid and high frequencies, and we're going to talk about that for just a little bit here. But then, so we're talking about mid and high last class, and we're going to move into this low frequency absorption. And this is a little bit challenging to talk about because it's this, well, when we get to, well, actually, we'll talk about when we get to it today. Like when we get to it, like what the challenge is behind it. So let's continue on with this, and so we're going to get to low frequency stuff down here. So this is a big one right here. Low frequency diaphragmatic absorbers. This is like a whole section unto itself. So I really want to spend some time talking about it, but it also needs a little bit of context for some stuff that's coming, I think, next week. So it's kind of like this chicken or the egg or the cart before the horse kind of thing where these two kind of concepts are related to one another, but it's hard to talk about one without the other, but you have to like dive in. So we'll start talking about this now, but then we're going to talk about like room modes. And then we're going to come back and hopefully talk more about this. If we have time talking about, again, circle back and talk about this, how to address this, but we'll get through it. We'll start talking about it today in pretty good detail. Okay. So we left off last class talking about this idea of like open cell foams. And the idea is that, again, we want to stay away from closed cell foams because closed cell foams don't allow the sound or the energy. It doesn't allow the air inside the foam to flex, to push and pull, because they're a bunch of little closed off cells, and so therefore the energy doesn't translate between those air pockets. So when we talk about foam, like just in general, like foam is just like it's a material that has a bunch of little tiny air pockets in it. And we need those air pockets to be able to connect one another if we want the air to squish and pull, because we want the air to be able to move through that and like, well, absorb it by using friction. So when we talk about this, like, so specialty, so I spent a fair amount of time last class talking about how to DIY your own using things like fiberglass from Home Depot, which, or the acoustic, the Bonded Logic Ultra Touch, which I'm super fans of both of those. But of course, in a pinch, and of course you'll see like a lot of people do it, and a lot of major studios and home studios alike use off the shelf acoustic foam. So like Orlex, Sonix, actually I misspelled that. Sonix has two N's. You can also find generic. So fiberglass works better and is cheaper, but foam is super easy. So fiberglass, you have to just deal with it because it's fiberglass. If you can afford it, you can get the rigid fiberglass, the Owens Corning 703, which is awesome. But again, it's harder to find. Quite expensive, can be worth it. So a 12 2-foot by 2-foot Orlex foam panels for $290. That's really expensive. So $6 per square foot compared to $0.5, 50 cents a square foot for fiberglass. So it's 12 times the price for doing acoustic foam than it is for fiberglass. Granted, this is a loaded comparison because this is just raw fiberglass. It's not putting it in frames and covering it with fabric. But you can see that just a little bit of DIY, and this stuff, it's thicker. I would argue that it's actually even better. We can actually compare absorption coefficients, and I would be willing to bet that this fiberglass even works better. So, but you have to be a little bit handier with it. So the Orlex does work. So when we look at like Orlex, so this is like the stuff you'll see in all over the place. So you see these bass traps, and we'll talk a little bit about bass trapping today in a little bit, but the foams come in different colors and different sizes and shapes. And, you kind of your classic looking studio. This is kind of like an old school way, but that's like kind of the expensive one. If you want to find like generic ones, let me just pull up. So like back in the day, like Marker Tech is a good, but you can even just get it off eBay too. But Marker Tech, if you haven't bought anything from them before, Marker Tech is a great place to buy like some of this acoustic foam, like for pretty cheap. Let's see if I can find. So they have a lot of the Orlex here, but they have them in their house brand right here. So they have like Marker Tech 54 by 54, 2-inch gray. So $72 for a 5-foot by 5-foot, about So close to about 5.5, 4.5 feet of this like kind of egg cartony looking foam. So it's pretty expensive. But do they give specs on it? Data sheet. Cool. They give their okay. So we can see their acoustic their coefficients right here. This is kind of cool. They actually give it like they're showing you what's happening there. But so this is like that's cool. They did it as a plot. So they're showing it that the difference between the 2-inch and the 3-inch. We could see that the 2-inch is pretty good, but the 3-inch is a little bit better. So how much is the 3-inch? So that was expensive, but that's $72 for a 4 foot by 4 foot. That's a lot of money, I think. So here's the 3-inch. It's $81. So actually, if I was going to go with this, I would opt for the 3-inch just because it's only a couple more bucks and it's significantly better in terms of performance. So we can see that, but we can see that it's a pretty linear, which is kind of interesting that it's linear like this, that it just drops off. But you can see that again, it doesn't do very well at these lower frequencies. It kicks in pretty good around the 500 hertz range. And again, we know the reason is because we know that because of wavelength, right? Because even if it's 2-inch or 3-inch wavelength, that if I do the wavelength for 250 hertz, which is actually help me out with that. What's the wavelength for 250 hertz? So V equals F times lambda. Solve for frequency, V over lambda. I'm sorry, V over F. So 344 divided by 250. What is 344 divided by 250? Help me out with that. Anybody? I can do it on my own calculator, but I want you guys to be doing it too. Okay, 1.376. Good. So that means that the wavelength is 1.376 meters long. That's like yay big. And if we look at 3-inch acoustic foam, it's only going to be about that big, right? So compared to this giant wavelength relative to this small foam, it's not going to like the wave is so much larger than the thickness of the foam that it's not really going to affect it very much. So therefore, that's why we see this thing dropping down right here. Cool. Yeah. 1 is a perfect absorber. Yes. So yeah, 0 is a perfect reflector. 1 is a perfect absorber. Good question. Cool. All right. So anyway, if you're looking for like, so you can get on Amazon, you can get it all over, like you can get this foam all over the place. So there's, see what else they have in here. I think they have some generic ones in here. Yeah. So Orlex mineral fiber. So you can just use mineral fiber. I guess I really didn't talk about that. So mineral fiber. So mineral fiber is essentially, and I'm not sure the chemical process for it, but basically you can take this mineral. It's like rocks, right? And it's able to be injected with air, and it becomes like this. Well, let's take a look at it. You can find this also. It's called mineral wool sometimes too. This is another inexpensive way of doing it. So if we look for a mineral wool, so yeah, it's molten mineral or rocks, such as slag and ceramics. So it's not, it's like fiberglass, but it's rock. It's hard to explain it, but it's not, it's like fiberglass, but you can touch it. It's you don't want to like get it in the air, but you can touch it. But, let's just find some images for it. You can also find this at insulation. So it's also used as a thermal insulator, and it's pretty inexpensive, and you can find it all over the place. Like also at those insulation supply places that I was talking about last time. So a lot of acoustic companies that make acoustic panels use mineral wool or mineral fiber. So this is another good alternative. Again, I love using the bonded logic stuff, but if I wasn't using bonded logic, I'd use this mineral wool. So you can find this for pretty inexpensive at local supply places, but it looks like they're selling it. Markertech or whatever, Orlex actually sells it raw, and it's a little bit stiffer. So you still kind of need to put a frame around it, but it's way more rigid than loose fiberglass, but it's not as rigid as, well, I guess you could say it's about the same as foam. But it looks pretty ugly, so you're gonna want to cover it. So they're doing 4-inch for $149 for what size? How much do you get there? Per box, 6 per box. So you get 6 of these things per box for $150. That's not too bad. But again, if I was going to do this, these ones are going to be probably pretty rigid. But if I was getting it from installation supply place, it's going to be a lot less expensive, but it's probably not going to be as rigid. So that's another one that's another alternative you can use instead of fiberglass. All right. So, so now what we want to do is let's look at other kind of common absorbers. So this is kind of like pulled from the book, like the categories we're going to talk about here. We're going to look at other absorbers, things that absorb sound, like carpet and curtains and stuff, and like look at the effects of that. And what we're trying to do is not try to remember every single detail on every single graph. We're just trying to get a feel for what's happening with the sound there. So let's talk about drapes. So drapes are a big one, right? So drapes as sound absorbers can work well depending on material, degree, fold, and distance from wall. So we call this degree of fold, like right here, like this curtain right here has a lot of degree of fold. It's not stretched flat. It's got a lot of, even when these curtains are drawn, they have a lot of folding in there. And that's actually what we're going to want to see. And we'll see, well, we can probably guess what the effects are of this going to be. We want to see like, well, let's just take a look at it. So let's take a look at drape fabric weight. So heavier and thicker is better. And that goes along with our intuition. So the heavier it is, the thicker it is, the better. So velour is good because of microfibers. So all those, so velour or like, yeah, I guess velour or like, yeah, I guess that's the best term to describe it, is all the little tiny hairs. It's got it's got a fuzz to it, right? And that fuzz, especially because all that those little tiny fuzz, those little tiny hairs, those hairs are creating friction for those air molecules when they're moving back and forth. So again, trying to develop this intuition of like how the sound is being absorbed. If I've got all these little tiny microfibers and the air is pushing and pulling on it, those microfibers are going to cause a lot of friction. And so that's going to be a good thing. So velour is going to be a really good sound absorber right there. And then the heavier is better. So this is in 18 ounces per yard. And I don't really have a good understanding of like, is this heavy or is this light? But what's interesting is we see that, like looking at this, velour hung flat. So this is hung totally flat against the wall. And that what we see, or not against the wall, but just hung in free space. That 18 ounce, well, between 10 and 14 doesn't seem to matter very much. But between 14 and 18, it's a big one. We see that, we're getting up to about 0.5 coefficient, about the 1 kilohertz range. So this is an important range right in here. And so it's actually doing pretty good, but it stops. I'm surprised it stops absorbing as well, better at 4K than these other two. It's still not bad, about a 0.3 absorption coefficient. And then just like with everything else, as we go down lower in frequencies, the wavelengths get a lot longer, and therefore the fabric becomes less important. And so it absorbs less sound, because the sound is going to transmit through the fabric and just keep on going because those wavelengths are so large. It's probably just going to move the fabric itself and just transmit through the fabric. And so it's not going to really absorb anything right there. But good to know. So what we pull from here is the heavier the carpet, the better. Anything is better than nothing. But if you have a choice and you want to be able to hang curtains, this would be a good one. And if you like at Studio J on campus, if you're in there and you look up around the top of the studio, you actually have curtains, and you can actually open this. Carter, is there a stick? How do you open those? How do you change the curtain on those? Do you know how to do that? Yeah. So the idea is that the cool thing with something like this is that what it allows you to do is if you have curtains in a space, you can use them to control variable acoustics. And that's something that we want to start thinking about when we're designing a studio space. One studio does not fit all. So what's good for, like, as same when we were talking about reverb, what's good for one kind of instrument or recording situation may not be good for another one. So in my case, like, I really like live drums. I like my room to be very, very live. But then when I want to record vocals, if you're lucky enough that you have a vocal booth, then that's great. But in a lot of studios, you're going to try to use one space for a lot of different things. And so we're trying to create variable acoustics or adjustable acoustics. And one of the ways we can do that is with curtains. So if you have curtains, and so like I was saying in Studio J, there's curtains hanging up around the top of the room. And with the intention, I believe, when it was designed, is that you can actually draw those curtains out. So if you want to get more of a live room, you can have the curtains all the way pushed to the corner. And if you want to deaden the room, you can pull those things out a little bit. And so you can see what the effects are. It's going to adjust it around like this. And so again, that's, if you happen to be like at a garage sale or something like that, and you see some curtains, I don't know, some cool old crazy curtains, it'd be fun to like jazz up your studio a little bit and add some curtains as part of your acoustic treatment. But this is of course go ahead. Oh, that's cool. That's awesome that you actually notice the difference between recording with and without them. So yeah, very, very cool. And so you'll see these in theaters a lot. So theaters have like different curtains, like for obvious reasons. So, but yeah, you can use them in studios as well. Okay, so look at the drape folding. Let's take a look at the folding in here. So more folding is better, as we can kind of imagine. So more surface area is exposed and very distance from the wall. So what this is doing is it's essentially, when I say very distance from the wall, if we put the curtain in front of here and we slosh it, we pull the curtain together, it's going to create this like thing that looks like that, right? And so it creates a thicker environment, but it's also like I said, very distance from the wall. So it's going to absorb a wider frequency band, and also there's more surface area exposed for those little microfibers to like create more friction right there. So draped to half the area is like really good, right? And then as we go down to 3/4 and down to 7/8 area, so we can see that as the curtains get squished up, they get a lot better. So they're like, well, what we need to do is then, even with the curtains all the way drawn, they need to be loose. We don't want to draw the curtains so they're tight. So even when they're drawn, we want to have enough fabric. But velour, especially like theater velour, like heavyweight velour, is crazy expensive. The black box theater I'm working up in Boulder, they have these like giant black curtains that you pull around, and I think they were something like $10,000 for those curtains. It's like it's a lot of fabric, but that stuff is expensive. So keep your eye out if you ever see like a theater that's going under, or a garage sale, or like sometimes they'll be getting rid of used ones. Pick those things up because they're valuable. You can do some cool stuff with that. Okay, let's take a look at drape distance. So if we do this, so it's most like, this is the same thing we saw with the foam, is that it's most effective at a 1/4 wavelength. So what we're doing here is we have a solid wall and a porous material right here. And as we move things to a 1/4 wavelength, so this is at a frequency of 1000 hertz. So we're 1/4 wavelength from the wall. So this goes from bottom to top to bottom, or we can imagine it keeps going down here. That this right here is at a 1/4 wavelength right here. And what it's going to do, or sorry, oh, I'm sorry, this is not the sine wave. This is the frequency and distance. Oh, wow, this is confusing. This is a tough way to look at this. But we see that at a 1/4 wavelength, it absorbs a ton, and at half a wavelength, it absorbs very little. So this is for a frequency of 1000 hertz. And now in this one, what we're going to do, so what we're looking at is adjusting the distance from the wall and keeping our frequency fixed. And in this one here, what we're looking at as a function of frequency, and we're going to look at the distance from the wall, and we can see that at a 1/4 wavelength, it's a very absorbent. At half wavelength, it's not very absorbent. At 3/4, it's very absorbent and not absorbent. Absorbent, not absorbent. Kind of like comb filtering, right? We can see that these are essentially odd harmonics. So if this was, well, this is 100, 200, let's call this like 250 maybe. That 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's kind of hard to, I don't know what the frequency, this peak is right here, but we can see that it's really good here, really bad there, really good there, really bad there, really good there, and so on and so forth. So, and yeah, as we get higher in frequency, that the wavelengths get so much smaller that basically it's going to be hitting at the 1/4 wavelength at some point right here. So, because if we imagine that this is going to be a 1/4 wavelength for the first harmonic, the second harmonic, it's going to be at a null. This is kind of hard to explain, but we can see that basically, well, I think the thing to draw away from here is that if you pull the carpet or anything away from the wall, it's going to absorb at lower frequencies better. But you do have these kind of harmonic issues with this. So, but as you can see what's happening here, as we go up in harmonics, they're going to get bunched up closer and closer and closer together, so that essentially you're going to have this comb filtering effect at the higher frequencies. But because they're so tight together, it effectively acts, and this is an idealized condition. In real world, it's not going to be quite this, but as you get higher, it's going to act pretty much as a straight absorber. But at lower frequencies, you're going to have these kind of notches, these notch filtering, this like comb filtering effect at these lower frequencies. But pretty interesting. So pulling the curtains away from the wall does affect it, though. So let's talk about carpet for a minute. So carpet, we all kind of have this intuition that a carpeted room is going to be much more dead sounding room than a live room. So yeah, so we very common, but we use for aesthetic and comfort over acoustic properties. So when we put carpet in a room, it's not because we want to deaden the room typically, but it is because we want to make it softer for our feet, and just because it's nice, like we like carpet. But kind of the modern design aesthetic is to not have carpet, right? So I watch any of those makeover shows, and you see people pull up like these old like 1980s carpet, and they are covering up these beautiful hardwood floors, or what we call now beautiful hardwood floors. But back in the day, they're like, cover that wood up, which is funny to, you think about fashion and design trends, like what each generation thinks the other generation was crazy for doing it. Cause like those old turn of the century houses, these Victorian houses have these like, well, what we call beautiful hardwood floors, but in Victorian era, they're like, oh, cover all that wood up. Let's get rid of that. We don't want to see any of that wood. So, so let's talk about carpet. So the problem is now everybody wants to pull up all this carpet, and now these rooms sound like like reverb chambers or echo chambers. Every living room sounds terrible, and especially if you're trying to watch, like you're turning it into like a home theater room with a nice Sonos speaker system or something like that in there. It's so reverberant that like watching a movie in one of these rooms is just awful. I can't stand it. So, but let's take a look at how this thing works. So absorbs well at high frequencies and poor at low. That kind of makes sense. Bodes along well with what we've been talking about. That carpet is only usually going to be, between this and that thick. That those high frequencies are going to get absorbed because as we approach the quarter wavelength to that carpet, it's going to work pretty well. But as we get longer, our wavelength gets longer and longer. As in other words, as the frequencies get lower, that carpet it doesn't see the carpet. It doesn't affect it because the wavelengths are so long. So it leads to poorly tuned and unbalanced reverberation. So yes, this is absolutely what happens. So if we look at this one right here, so comparison of sound absorber characteristics of 3 different types of carpet, whatever. We can look at the trend here, and we can see that at the higher frequencies, it does a really good job of absorbing it. But then as we go in lower frequencies, just as we've seen with everything else, it doesn't absorb very well. So the result is that it's going to be it's going to be reverberant at low frequencies and absorbent at high frequencies. So the term, what we would give for that, it's going to be a warm sounding room. When we say that something is a warm sounding room, it tends to mean that the high frequencies are being absorbed and the low frequencies are being reverberant. So that's usually kind of the trend. So going back to what kind of our goals are in terms of absorption and also just reverberation, we want a smooth roll off at all the frequencies. So that means what we need to do is we need to absorb, like if we have a carpeted room and we want smooth reverb, we need to add some low frequency reverb into that room to kind of absorb more at these lower frequencies down here. So different padding makes a big difference. So open cell is much better than closed cell. So when we talk about carpet padding, usually if you go look at like a carpet store, or if you've had carpet, or you can start, I've installed carpet myself a few times. I do not want to do that again. It sucks. I'm so bad at it. If you watch the pros, they make it look so easy. I was like, I could totally do that. And so I tried to carpet my basement when I had my studio down there. I sucked so bad at it. There's definitely an art to carpet installation. But when you add that carpet underlayment, it's like, it's usually like a bunch of recycled foam stuck together, kind of like with glue and with this adhesive and with this netting kind of stuff, this mesh kind of thing that they stick it to. So it's kind of a combination, which I think is it would yield pretty good results. So like I said, like I think last time, like if you're in a pinch and if you want to add some cool like absorption to your room, you could go buy carpet underlayment. It kind of looks neat too, but you could cover it up with material. So you could stack it and even make kind of sculptural elements out of carpet foam and make some pretty cool absorbers out of this stuff. And it's super cheap too. So it's like, I mean, it's only like 1/2 inch thick, but it's crazy inexpensive. So if you wanted to make some really cool, neat designed absorbers that are weird shapes, because it comes in like 12-foot rolls. So if you wanted to make a giant circle or oval or like a jelly bean looking shape or something like that, make a logo out of make a giant logo absorber, you could. Or like maybe you're doing an art piece. So you can also kind of make art acoustic absorbers, right? I think that's really cool when you can do some of that. And this would be a good starting material for some of that stuff. Cool. So yeah, move on. Sound absorption by people. This is a big one, as we've all probably experienced in our lifetime, especially if you are a stage musician, where you are, say you're in an orchestra or a concert band or something like that, where you are practicing on stage. That when you have an empty auditorium versus a full auditorium, it sounds wildly different. And that's because people absorb sound really good. So let's look at the absorption coefficients of people. So So they're talking about Sabins right here. So remember when we were talking about that, like it's the capital A is a Sabine, or they call them Sabins. Um, that five. So a person adds 5 Sabins I guess 5 Sabins, like on average, kind of across the board right here. So these aren't necessarily directly absorption coefficients, but it does give us a vibe on this thing. And we think about this, we're squishy, right? So we can see that we actually absorb pretty good across the across the spectrum, which is kind of interesting. So when you add people into a room, they tend to absorb it down a lot more. And I guess that was called in years ago. Well, and I did this thing for Jamestown up in the mountains. They had a community space that they wanted us to it was a community space that they felt was too loud, and they wanted to add some more absorption in there. So the problem was, so I go in there and I ring out the room, and when I ring out, I do the room ring out like we've been talking about, and they're asking me to consult on how much absorption they need. And so my question was, I'm like, well, it depends on how many people you have in the space, because if you have a lot of people in the space, it's pretty dead. But if you only have a few people in the space, it's super live. So that if you want to try to have a kind of a constant experience, that's where you have to have adjustable acoustics, where basically you have like foam panels that are behind hard panels that open up. And so it became like, well, I was pretty green at the time, and it was a tough challenge for me. But basically I was like, well, it depends on what you're trying to go for here. It's kind of the answer I gave them, which they didn't like the answer of. So, but yeah, so the idea is that basically people add a lot of absorption, and one of the things I thought was another kind of side story on that was I went to Dolby Laboratories, like years and years and years ago, and they have this auditorium upstairs, and it was really interesting because Dolby being Dolby, they're all about sound, and they had this screening room, and they had these special chairs that basically they absorbed the same amount of sound as if a person was sitting in it or not. So the cool thing is these special, super expensive acoustic chairs absorbed, so that when I sat down on a chair, the chair and me had the same absorption coefficient or Sabins as if I was not in the chair at the same time. So the cool thing is what it did is whether you had an auditorium full of people or just an auditorium with 1 or 2 people in it, it had the same acoustic experience. So from a mixing perspective, that gave us a common ground, or from a performance perspective, it gave us like a very common perspective, which is really cool. It may have been a little overkill, and I didn't actually see any of the numbers on the thing, but I thought it was kind of a cool concept of that. They basically built auditoriums that were the same as if people were full of people or not. Of course, when you have people in there, they're shuffling, they're breathing, they have programs that they're shuffling paper on and all that kind of stuff. So it does make a difference. The ambience of the room is different when you have people in it when it's not, but kind of interesting. But people absorb a lot of sound. Yeah. Because we're wearing more fabric. So this is pulled. This is, yeah. I mean, so it's pulled straight from the book, and so I'm paraphrasing the book right there, but I'm assuming that it's just more fabric, which is just more like increases the absorption coefficient. Because if we think about like kind of physically what we are, is we're squishy, so we absorb actually pretty low frequencies pretty well, but at higher frequencies, I mean, because the sound doesn't actually penetrate into us very well, it's going to we do act as somewhat kind of reflectors. Whereas if I have a bunch of fabric on top of me, it's going to increase the absorption coefficient. So that basically I would say that we have higher frequency absorption through our clothes and lower frequency absorption through our, we're going to see it here when we talk about the low frequency absorption, but it's transduction. Basically, when I can push and pull on something and set it into vibration, and then I can damp that vibration out, that I guess people absorb low frequencies and then our clothes absorb the higher frequencies, kind of. But I'm not entirely sure. I'm guessing on that one a little bit there. So, especially in you could also, I would imagine you say also in the winter versus the summer, right? So if we're at a black tie classical concert and you have a lot of people that are going to be showing a lot of skin, that's going to be not as absorptive as if you have in the winter when people are wearing a lot of coats and jackets, and even usually you have a coat check, but if people have their jackets with them and fuzzy stuff, it's going to be a little bit more absorbed. And we're talking on a larger scale here, like if you're talking about an outdoor concert, this isn't going to make any difference really at all. Because if I guess you imagine like, well, we didn't really talk about it, but like ground and grass and that kind of stuff, grass will absorb sound pretty well for the same reasons all this other stuff. It traps in it. It creates a lot of friction. Versus if you're on a concrete pavement, like in a parking lot, that's going to be highly reflective. And then adding people in there. So adding people on grass for a festival isn't going to change very much, but adding people on concrete will make a big difference. But it's not reverberant, right? It's just reflective, because if you're outside, nothing reflects. So, okay. So let's get into this big, hairy subject called low frequency absorption. I've kind of alluded to it, but, well, okay, let's dig into it here. So when we talk about low frequency absorption, porous absorbers work well at mid-high frequencies because the wavelengths are small. So this is where doing that math, V equals F times lambda, doing the wavelength equation a lot. I do this equation all the time. It's good to get a feel for, like, this is 2000 hertz. This is 100, 100 or 100 hertz or whatever, figuring it out, just kind of loosely understanding that low frequencies have long wavelengths and high frequencies have short wavelengths. And then as the wavelengths get longer, the porous materials get relatively small compared to the wavelength of the material. So to absorb low frequencies, what I can do is I can just make the material thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. But the problem is trying to reach, so we talk about, say, we'll just use, because I can remember the number, 20 hertz. Like the lowest frequency has a wavelength of 17 meters. So that means if I want to absorb 20 hertz, I need to have, well, what's a quarter? I'm just going to roughly estimate. I'm just going to call it 20 for it. 20 hertz has a 20 meter wavelength, just so I can figure out. So a quarter wavelength is going to be 5 meters. So that means I need to have 5 meter thick foam to absorb 20 hertz. Well, that's a bit of a problem inside of a room, right? Because my room probably isn't even 5 meters wide. So this is a real problem. So yeah, using porous absorbers for low frequency become too thick. So, okay, yeah, here's an example. So 100 hertz wavelength is 3.4 meters. So, which is like 11 feet. So that means at a quarter wavelength, I need 3 feet thick material to absorb 100 hertz effectively. That's just unpractical, right? For most spaces. You could do this in a large hall or something like that. But even then, 3 feet thick of absorption of absorbent material, that's going to cost a fortune. That's just ridiculous. So instead, what we're going to do is what we call resonant absorbers. So this is kind of an interesting way to think about this. So what we're going to do is we're going to use absorbing, I mentioned it last time. We talked about this thing, kinetic energy and potential energy. So kinetic energy is energy in motion, and potential energy is stored energy. So you could also imagine it when sound is pushing on something. So when sound bunches up and creates a compression against, say, a surface, that's going to push on that surface. So we have that potential energy against that wall. So I don't want to go on that. Maybe if we have time, I'll go to it later. But if we imagine this, a compression wave hitting a wall, it's going to squish up against the wall, and all those air molecules push on the wall, and then they reflect off it and bounce away. But when they squish up against that wall, it's creating potential energy against that wall. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow that wall to have give. So when that air squishes up against that wall, it's going to push on that wall, and then it's basically going to transduce that potential energy of the air against the wall into kinetic energy of the wall vibrating or surface. I'm saying wall, but we're saying it's called diaphragmatic absorption. So it's diaphragm. So it's going to move back and forth. And so it's going to have some give to it. And so that allows us to absorb potential energy. So absorbing potential energy is the trick. So we absorb mid to high frequencies by absorbing kinetic energy, and we absorb low frequencies by absorbing potential energy. So convert potential energy to motion that can be damped out. So that's kind of the trick. I remember when I learned this, I was like, oh, that's amazing. That's like something I've been doing this acoustic stuff for a while, but it was kind of this aha moment for me. Okay. So here's the catch though. So these absorbers are tuned absorbers. So they have to be tuned for the room and custom built. You cannot buy, you can buy what we call bass traps. But for the most part, those are I would say those are kind of like relatively broadband. But for the most part, what you're going to do is when you absorb low frequencies, you have to custom build them for the space. And there just pretty much isn't anything, you can't buy diaphragmatic absorbers off the shelf. They just don't exist. So, because every room is different and every situation is different. So that's why you typically, I mean, there's probably somebody who's making them, but generally speaking, you have to custom build these things. The cool thing is the custom building these things is really easy. There's not that much tools or materials to go into doing this. So let's talk about this. So diaphragmatic absorbers. So this is what I was talking about before. So this is where a diaphragm is something like a diaphragm is something that moves. So you think about like the diaphragm of a microphone. The diaphragm is the thing that moves back and forth. So when I speak into a microphone, the diaphragm is being pushed and pulled on there. And then the same thing you can think about a speaker. A speaker is a diaphragm. So a speaker is the opposite. It's transducing energy from electrical to it's pushing and pulling on the air. But a diaphragm is something that just moves back and forth. So okay, so here's a kind of a very common diaphragmatic absorber you'll see, especially things in like concert halls. You'll see this one right here. So they also call them panel absorbers. So it's tuned to a specific frequency. So panel density and air gap behind it influence the resonant frequency. We have not some math, but we have some charts that we can use to help tune these things. Panel's resonance causes the panel to move and absorb the energy, and the damping material helps. So it acts like a mass spring. So what we have here, so I have a like 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch space behind this panel right here. So like basically something like a 2x4. And then I have a thin panel right here. And then so it's a 1/4 inch to 16th inch plywood. And we'll see how do you choose the distance and the plywood. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have like 1 or 1.5 inch glass, glass or fiberglass or mineral fiber, which, the mineral fiber is probably super inexpensive for something like this. And then what this does is if we imagine the sound is going to come along and hit this panel, and it's going to like, because it's like we can imagine this being something like a drum head, or I think that's probably the best example, like a drum head. So if I hit this drum head, it's going to vibrate and it's going to resonate. So it's going to set this thing into resonance. So because based off of the thickness of this material and the distance from the wall, is going to have a resonance to it. And that's the tuning that we're talking about. And we can tune this based off of the thickness of this material. Just like you can tune your guitar with the tension of the string or the thickness of the string. Like that's essentially the same thing we're doing right here. So what this is going to do is this thing is going to resonate. Well, that's going to be kind of bad. What we don't want is we don't want resonance. This thing has a natural resonant frequency that it vibrates to. But what we want to do is we want to quickly dampen that energy out. And so that's what the purpose of this damping material, this mineral fiber behind here does. So it's going to absorb that energy as it gets transduced from potential energy to kinetic energy. And then the kinetic energy we can absorb pretty easily. So in essence, we're still absorbing it in terms of kinetic energy, but what we're doing is we're able to tune this thing to a really low frequency, and then this thing so we have kinetic energy of the air, of that sound moving through air. It sets this thing into vibration. So the potential energy squishes up against this. This sets into oscillation, which then transduces or creates kinetic energy behind it, which we can then damp out pretty effectively. So that's kind of our trick. And this one is really pretty effective. So when you're next time, I don't know if we have any in the concert halls in here, but I can't remember where I was. I don't know. You'll see these panel absorbers around spaces, but in concert halls, it's not, the low frequencies are not really a big problem, but you will find them. So that's a really good way of doing, of absorbing these things. So let's do a corner one here. So this is a really good way of doing like a corner version of this thing. So yeah, so it says, so it can also re-radiate because of resonance. So this is why you have that damping material behind it. If you don't have that damping material in it, it'll essentially ring. That diaphragmatic motion will also re-radiate, which is what you don't want. I remember like I was at Rocky Mountain Audio Fest, and this if you ever been to an audiophile convention, it's full of charlatans and snake oil. And they come up with these crazy things, like crazy stuff. Like it's hard to describe it, but basically in at these audiophile conventions, there's a lot of money. Like speakers cost tens up to $100,000 worth of speakers. And they when you have that kind of money and that kind of margins, the sharks show up too. And they try to sell all sorts of crazy stuff. And the audiophile world is full of voodoo and just like misinformation, which is why I started talking at these things. And I remember walking around. I like for whatever reason I was giving a talk at this conference, and they gave me a press pass. I don't know why, because and it's funny because when you have a press pass versus a speaker pass, everybody wants to talk to press because that's the point, right? They want to get in the press. And so I remember I walked into this room and I was just like touring around, just taking in the space. Like, we'll look out for it next year. It's in this is upcoming October. It's called the Rocky Mountain Audio Fest. It's basically they take over. It's over at the Gaylord Hotel out by DIA, and they take over a huge chunk of the hotel. And they got every room out of the, not every room, but like multi floors of rooms. They take them out and they put in like crazy listening rooms in every one of these rooms. And people sell everything from crazy expensive cables to turntables to amps to speakers to all this kind of stuff. Headphones, vinyl. It's pretty fun, but this one person was selling these little like bells, these little tiny like metal bells. And what they did is they were resonant bells. And the argument was that they put them up all over in the room and they essentially act as re-radiators. So what they do is they resonate. So when a high frequency, they're tuned bells. So when a sound hits this bell, we'll just say 5,000 hertz, just as an example. The sounds hit these bells, these bells sympathetically resonate and then they ring. And then the argument was this guy was, so he comes over to me, he's like, oh, you got to see these things. And he's like, he set all these bells all over the place, and he fires up some music. And I was like, and he's like, yeah, it opens up the space. They have all these terms. It's like, it opens up the space. It makes it breathes. It widens the stereo field. It does all these kind of things. And I'm like, well, isn't that distortion? Because to me, anything that's not the original wave is distortion. And which, I mean, EQ is distortion. So there's good distortion and there's bad distortion. And for me, his argument was that this is good distortion. My argument was that this is bad distortion. And he's like, well, this opens this up. It does all this kind of stuff. And I was like, really? And so like, and they're used to like peddling bad science. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. He's like, wait, so who do you write for? I was like, oh no, I don't write. I'm actually, I'm giving a talk on physics of acoustics downstairs. And all of a sudden his tone totally changed. And he's like, oh, he's like, it's our theory that does this. And as soon as you throw "it's our theory" in front of it, you can qualify that. You can say whatever you want, right? So all science goes out the window, and then all of a sudden you can say whatever you want. So, but basically, to me, re-radiation is bad. Ringing is bad. That's distortion. That's like it's like, I don't want my room to ring at 5,000 hertz. That's like annoying. That's terrible. So I'm like, I don't know. I could go on and on and on. I have many stories about these sort of things, but I could go on and on about it. Exactly. It really is. And I don't want to harsh on anybody. I mean, I don't like people selling bad science, but I do support, people trying to make a living and making cool, innovative products and all this kind of stuff. I think that's really neat. But I hate it when people peddle bad science and try and sell snake oil. Because okay, one more story. I can't help it. But when I was there, you'll probably hear me talk about this next semester in critical listening. But like they sell, amber. Like, what's amber? Anybody know what amber is? Like, I heard somebody say it's petrified sap. Yeah. So it's like petrified sap, and it's like it's beautiful. You can make jewelry out of it and all this kind of stuff. So what people would do is they make these beads out of it, and you put them up on top of your receiver, your tuner, or your amplifier, and it's supposed to make it sound better. And why? Because it's amber. And they come up with all these kind of harebrained electromagnetic fields and all this kind of stuff, but you're like, dude, it's amber. It's pretty. I get it. But they sell these little rocks for like $200 a rock, and you're supposed to put them up on your amplifier, and it's supposed to make it sound better. It's like pure voodoo. Like, and voodoo's not even the right word. It's just bad. So, but it's crazy. You see all these kind of products out there that are just like, what? If you have any foundation in science, it just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's crazy. I could go on and on, but I'll leave that one there. It is. Yeah. The, yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Wait, so Billy, are you our AES rep? Are you AES student rep? Are you part of that? Oh, cool. Nice. Very cool. Yes. Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah. So yeah, get involved with AES. There's that's a good plug for AES. Get involved with it. Like it's it ebbs and flows at our college here, but AES is awesome. So there's some pretty neat stuff. So AES is like the science side of everything, and then you have this whole other world, the audiophile world, and like Ethan had mentioned, the cabling. We'll talk about that in other classes. The cabling industry is just crazy. So, because you go to any store like Best Buy or whatever, like all the money is in accessories, right? Like that's where all the markup is. If you've ever worked retail, that's what they always tell you to push is all the accessories. It's like cables, especially, because like hardware and like that stuff, there's the margins aren't that great on that, but like whatever USB cables and speaker wires and cables and all that stuff, there's a huge margin on that. And when there's huge margins, that attracts the sharks, like I said. So, okay, so this is interesting. So we'll talk about this pressure maxima at walls and corners here later, but this is a great place to add it. So we add plywood, add a little bit of damping material, and you can have it wide open behind here. It doesn't even need to be damped, completely filled. I mean, filling it isn't bad, but you don't need so this is a very cost effective way of doing some good low frequency absorption. So should be at least 5 square feet. Yeah. So I guess it's important to know. Yeah, a panel absorber shouldn't be this big. If you're trying to absorb low frequencies, you need to have them large. In the same way that when we were talking about diffusion, so a large wavelength, it's not going to see a small object. You have to have a large object a large panel to absorb a low wavelength. So that kind of just bodes well with it. Where this came from, I don't know. This just kind of came from the book. That seems a little strange to me. So, like when we were talking about, remember it said flexible walls do the same thing. When we were looking at the absorption coefficients of gypsum or of 2x4 walls, that low frequency it seems to absorb. So, what it looked like the absorption coefficient for gypsum on two-sided with 2x4s, it looks like it absorbs really low frequencies really well. But really, what's happening is the wall actually vibrates pretty well. And so when it vibrates on one side, it actually re-radiates on the other side, which is why if you had like a sibling or a roommate or parents or friends and roommates living on the other side of the wall and they're blasting music on the other side of that wall, you can hear that come through because those low frequencies come through, but the high frequencies don't. And that's because those walls are set into vibration, which means that it's not anything that you hear in that room right there. And also just the diaphragmatic absorption of it is coming through into your room, which means it's not being absorbed in that room over there, which actually sounds pretty good in the other room. The low frequency is dying off pretty quick in the other room, but that means they're coming into your room, which is super annoying. And that's because there's not a lot of damping material. It's setting those walls into vibration, but it's just transmitting and re-rating it and into the other space. Well, it's also re-rating it into that room as well. But if we add some damping material to it, that's when we can actually dumb those things down. And we're actually going to look at that a lot coming up when we look at construction techniques for studio walls. When we look at how can we stop this from happening right here? We don't want this to happen. So we'll talk about some techniques in terms of isolation pretty soon here. Okay, this is right here. This little graph right here was kind of like my thing for a few years. What I did is in my studio. So in my studio in particular, I noticed that I had at our mixing console station, we had a real problem hearing 50 hertz. And it turns out by doing some measurements with our microphone, we could see that indeed that there was a 50 hertz standing wave from in our mixing position. So I wanted to create 50 hertz absorbers in this axis. We're going to talk more about room modes next class. I think it's next week. Ooh, I got to get moving here. But what this means right here is if I want to absorb 50 hertz, for instance, that's this one right here. What I can do is I can find, so this is plywood, or I can look at it in terms of surface density as in terms of ounces per feet. Blech. Who wants to use imperial? I would totally use metric for this, but you can use any material that has this sort of density right here. Or if you just want to go to Home Depot and buy some plywood, I would go buy, so if I want to absorb some at 50 hertz right here, I'm going to go buy some, let's just pretend I'm going to go buy some 1/4 inch plywood. Or actually, let's go buy some 1/8 inch plywood. 1/8 inch plywood is going to be pretty inexpensive. Actually, that's harder to find at Home Depot. Maybe let's do 3/16. Let's just get some 3/16 thing here. So what this tells me is if I want this to do, I have to do 50 hertz at 3/16 has to be about whatever, 22 inches away from the wall. So that's pretty far. That's almost 2 feet away from the wall. So absorbing these low frequencies. So I'm like, whoa, that's too deep. Well, what if I want to decrease my depth from the wall? So if I can go to a thinner, go to a thicker material. So if I go up all the way up to 1/2 inch for 50 hertz, then I'm only 8 inches from the wall. Cool. So that means if I go by 1/2 inch plywood and I stick it 8 inches away from the wall, it's going to absorb really well at 50 hertz. And of course, I have to put that damping material behind it so it dampens that out. But that's a pretty straightforward way of doing this. So what you do is you ring out your room, find out where the problem frequencies are going to be. So, and then you have to tune it. So this, like I said, this is a tuned absorber. But what we'll see next class is we can have to do the math. We have to figure out what are the problem frequencies. So look at this. Let's say, look at this 3/16 inch panel plywood with 2 inches of airspace is A. So that's actually pretty good. Look at that. I mean, it's not like we're not getting absorption coefficients way in the high ranges right here, but low frequencies are hard to absorb. And so if we look at this, like going down here, like we're getting an absorption coefficient of around 0.3 at 100 hertz with 3/16 inch plywood with 2 inches of airspace. That's pretty badass. That's pretty awesome. So if I go to B with 1/16 inch plywood with 1 inch mineral wool and a 1/4 inch airspace. So what B does now is it's really sharp at about whatever, 100, 200, 300, 350 hertz. It's absorbing really well at 350 hertz with this 1/16 plywood with 1 inch mineral wool and 1/4 inch airspace. So that's pretty tight. And then the same with 1/8 inch panel. So we can see the effects if I change it to a 1/8 inch panel from 1/16 to 1/8, that it drops down here. But this is pretty good absorption coefficient. So that's going to pull out those low frequencies pretty good, but it's pretty narrow, right? It's not this broadband absorber. So these are kind of, I mean, it's not terrible. I mean, it does pretty good through the range right here, but it does really well right here. So what you do, I mean, the method for this is take a tape measure and you measure out the room modes and then create a model with it. And then you're going to go through and you're going to create, you can also do this with Sabine's formula and figure out what the problems are. And then you're going to go through and you can find out, oh man, I have so much low frequency resonance here. Because I can add, like if I want to create a dead room, I can add a lot of mineral wool or something to the room, but I'm still going to have low frequency issues. And so I can add either a combination of these or tune them to the space to really absorb those low frequencies and to pull those out of there. So this is a very effective way of doing it. And so we did this. We did this above our mixing position. We built these absorbers that were like these giant absorbers above the mixing position. And actually what I did is I put foam on the outside of them. So I did the damping material on the outside. And so it was actually hard towards the ceiling. And then I did the damping material on the outside. And I can't tell you what a difference it made. It was like all of a sudden I could hear the kick drum. It's like, oh my God. Like because when I was building the space out, like I do all my own construction, and it took me a long time because like I was still doing all the electrical work and all that stuff, but we were still working in the studio at the time, and so I didn't have all my acoustic treatment done because acoustic treatment is usually the last thing that happens. You need to plan for it in the beginning, but it's usually the last thing to go in terms of aesthetics and acoustics because you have to do all your electrical and lighting and all that and HVAC and all that kind of stuff before you do your acoustic treatment. And so we were still mixing in there, and I was like, man, this is awful mixing in this room. And then all of a sudden we put those in, you're like, oh, I can actually hear the kick drum. It sounds amazing. It's awesome. Pretty cool. So we talked about these polycylindrical diffusers before. We call them polycylindrical diffusers before, but we can also do these polycylindrical absorbers. So what we do is, 45 inches wide by 16 inches curve, and then using something like, I don't know what they're using for the material. But we can see that we're getting some, if you fill it, so this is empty, and then this is estimated. I don't know why they're doing the estimated there. So this is pulled just from the book. So they call the chord dimension is the width. So the lower the better the base absorption. So above 500 hertz doesn't really change. So in fact, at above 500 hertz, it's going to be a good diffuser, and below 500 hertz, it's going to be a good absorber. So these would be a good like tool in your toolkit to throw these in your space. So if you have this along with some absorption materials, this would be a good diffuser, a good low frequency absorber, and then use the foam, acoustic foam or fiberglass to create a high frequency absorption. And that's going to give you a much more natural, neutral sounding room right there. So adding damping material really helps with the absorption and the Q. So Q, if you recall, like in parametric equalizers, the Q says how fat the thing is. So Q technically is peak height divided by peak width. It's the ratio of the height to the width. So something with a low Q is going to be really wide, and something with a sharp Q is going to be something that's very narrow. So when we're talking about absorption, most of the time we want to get something, we want to have a tuned absorber, but we want to have something with a kind of a wider range. So it's not just absorbing one frequency. We want to absorb a range of frequencies. So by adding absorption damping material, it's going to allow us to fill out the Q there. So here's how they kind of build these things. So if you want to build one, you can take a piece of wood right here, and this is done with a table saw. So you take a table saw at an angle right here and cut that angle in there to fit that groove in there. And then you just go get some 16th inch hardboard from Home Depot and, or wherever, Lowe's. And you can get it like in melamine. So you can get them in white, or you can get them in like the brownish color, or you can paint them, or you can do whatever you want. And yeah, you have to seal them up on all sides, and different sizes are a good idea. Like if you recall back when we were talking about polycylindrical diffusers, you don't want them to be too symmetric. You want them to kind of break them up a little bit. And that's going to, and then they're not showing it right here, but they're showing it. You need to put absorption. Like if you put in, say, some mineral wool or fiber behind here, or some insulation or whatever, don't put Orlex foam back there. That's too expensive for something like that. But that's going to absorb really well at those low frequencies. So, and you can see kind of at the range. So we're talking like 45 inches. That's 4 feet. That's big, right? 35, 28. So we can see that as we get smaller, it's like 20 inches wide by 8 inches deep. That's like compared to 16 inches deep. These are much smaller. They're still pretty good. But it's not as good as these giant ones down here. Cool. Let's talk about bass traps. Whoops. So, what we have here is this one is like, this is kind of a different way of doing a bass track. So we call it a reactive cavity absorber here. What we're going to do is it reduces the standing waves. So we're going to talk about standing waves coming up at bass frequencies. So the wave depth is tuned to 1/4 of a wavelength. So remember we were talking about like absorbing these low frequencies. Those depths you can't absorb at those. We can't have that much material in there. But what we can do is we can cut pockets in our walls and create like absorbers in pockets. And what we do is essentially it's a resonant cavity in the same way that our ear is a resonant cavity. But then what we're going to do is we're going to stuff it with a bunch of fiberglass. And what that's going to do is that's going to really dampen out. So essentially the same deal is we're taking potential energy and we're able to like take potential energy and convert it into kinetic energy, which we can absorb with these fiberglass panels right here. So, so it needs to be very deep to be effective. So you won't find this in your typical studio because you have to you have to have space on the other side of your room for this to happen. And so that's, if you're doing a very, very expensive build where space is not an issue and budget is not an issue, you can do something like this. But for the rest of us, not so much. What we tend to find is that, what most of us will find is like Orlex will sell bass traps. And so what they're going to do is they're going to put stuff in a corner. And at a corner, we're going to talk about this next week, but in corner is where there is at a pressure maximum. And so if we stick a bunch of foam, just stick a bunch of foam in the corner, it kind of has the same effect right here. So that's what we're talking about with bass traps right there. So we're going to push those into the corners right there, and it absorbs at pretty good low frequencies. And so you'll find it. Of course, you can buy the Orlex corner ones, but you can also just stick a bunch of foam and stuff in the corner as well. So those aren't going to be quite as tuned compared to if you did a hard corner one, but they will work pretty well. All right, what else we got? So Helmholtz resonators. Helmholtz resonators are pretty interesting. So if you think about a Coke bottle or like a 2 liter or whatever, like an old jug, just think about it like a jug, like like you think about like jug bands, right? People blow across the jug and it creates that low frequency. It creates that resonant frequency. But if you take like anything like a beer bottle and you blow across the top of it, you can set the bottle into resonance. Well, based off of the size of that bottle, what that's doing is basically a bottle is a mass spring system. It's the bottle, the air inside the bottle is acting as a spring, and then the lip of the mouth is acting as the mass. And so if I make the jug bigger, or make the thing bigger, it's going to go down because essentially the spring gets looser with the air inside of there. And if I keep the top the same and I make the bottom bigger, it gets lower in frequency because essentially it's the mass stays the same, but the spring gets looser, just as we did at the first week of school. It resonates at a low frequency. And the same thing happens if I make the volume smaller, the air acts as a tighter spring, and therefore the resonant frequency goes up. So we can think about it like this is a mass spring system. So undamped, it has a very high Q and it rings. So that's what I'm talking about. It's like blowing across a beer bottle will set that thing into oscillation. So that's essentially what we call Helmholtz resonator. And so we can tune. So this is like essentially right here. So this is the neck, this is the mass, and then this is the spring of the air inside of there. And what we can do is it resonates at a very particular frequency. And so that's what we call high Q. Oh, yeah, I wasn't even reading there. And so what we need to do is we need to actually have absorbing material in there to dampen that out. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to set this thing into resonance and absorb that energy as quickly as possible. So this is like a classic one. These are like old school, like people like, I don't know, in the 1700s learning how to work with Helmholtz resonators. But the more modern way of doing it is something like this. So you can go to Home Depot, buy a simple cardboard concrete tube, and then you make wood end caps for this thing. So you just take this tube and you can figure out what the volume of air inside of there is. And then you can which is the spring. And then you can figure out this duct. So the duct right here, it cuts in. You can have it poke out too, but cutting in makes a little more sense. And then they just have a wood bottom right there. And then what this is going to do is this is going to act as the mass and this is the spring. And then you lightly stuff it with like acoustic stuff or some sort of damping material like fiberglass or something like that. And it's going to dampen this thing out. And basically you can really tune this thing for your room. So the trick is what you do is, like I mentioned before, you go and you tune out a room and you figure out what the room mode frequencies that are at issue. And then for, I don't know, 20 or 30 bucks, you can go build one of these things and you can actually turn it into, like, if you put little wood feet on the bottom of this thing and paint it nice and you can put a plant on top of it and you got like, you can make these things like furniture, right? They don't have to be cylindrical. They can be kind of any shape. It's just a mass spring. This is the same reason. This is the same way that bass cabinets work. Like if you look at your speaker, and if I cut a driver in the front of this thing, and my speaker is playing right here, this box resonates at low frequencies, and that's how you get low frequencies coming out of your speaker. So this is the same way a bass reflex system works in speakers as well. Pretty interesting. So yeah, and there's calculators online. You can just search for these things. You can find Helmholtz resonator calculators around and find recipes for these things. And I keep meaning to do this. I have so in this room that I'm sitting in right now, I have a 70 hertz problem where I'm sitting right now. So I need to go through and I need to make a couple of these for this room because at my position right here, 70 hertz is a little bit dicey. It's not very great. So I need to absorb these things out. So it'll make a little bit more sense next class. Oh, I guess that was my last slide. Sweet. So I guess, let's just, since we're let's do what we did last time. Let's look at like some DIY acoustics on how we do some of these materials. Cause I'm just using Home Depot as my place just because I spend I pretty much know people, all the workers know me at Home Depot. I go to Home Depot like almost every day. Like I spend a lot of time there cause I buy a lot of like my materials there. I buy my specialty materials like, no, obviously like speaker stuff and grill cloth and all that kind of stuff at special places. But for my raw materials, a lot of times, like I buy my wood at at a special place, but like I buy fiberglass and I don't know, just like paint and adhesives and screws and nails and glue and all that kind of stuff at Home Depot. So I spend a lot of time there. So let's just go to Home Depot and take a look at some stuff. Let's look at so these are those concrete tubes right here. How much are they costing? Okay. So an 8-inch, or so like a 12-inch one for 4 feet is 14 bucks. So you do have to have some saws and stuff. Like, so if I want to make this thing shorter, I have to like have a saw to cut that thing down. And then I have to make some wood caps for that. But then PVC is pretty inexpensive as well. So just with some just like liquid nails and this, you're off to the races. You can make a pretty good Helmholtz resonators for pretty inexpensive. Let's try and find a calculator here. Oh, so I just saw. So someone asked what I think about the bass shaker speakers. So they're called tactile transducers. So if you want to go Parts Express, you'll find these things right here. You can buy expensive ones. They make like tactile transducers. don't know why my internet is so slow right now. But if you want to look at tactile, you call them bass shakers too. So you can get these. Here's one right here, actually, on the front page. Add low end feeling to your movies and games, being these bass shaker on the couch. So they're awesome. I love them. If you've never experienced them, I was a total skeptic, and then I saw these things. So these are expensive ones. You can buy like less expensive ones than these. Like, so for $200, this one right here, what you do is you take these things and you attach them to your couch or your chair, and at low frequencies, they shake your couch. And I was a super skeptic. I wouldn't use these in a mixing situation or anything like that, like a critical listening situation, but for entertainment, they're amazing. Especially if you live in an apartment or something. What you do is you attach these to your couch, and if you're watching movies, your couch shakes when there's like low frequency thumps, and it does this thing to your brain because like we didn't really talk about it when we were talking about the hearing system, but we do bone conduction. So when low frequencies hit you, we actually do hear a fair amount through bone conduction. In the same way, when you're talking, when you hear yourself talk, this is why we think it's weird when we hear ourselves on tape, because you hear yourself inside your head through bone conduction. And when you hear yourself recorded and played back, it sounds weird because you're not used to it. It sounds weird to you. But we hear a lot through conduction. And so when low frequencies hit us, we hear that through just our bodies in motion. And so what these do is these set our body into motion, and it feels like you're hearing it, and it feels like it's crazy. I love these things. They're amazing. It's like, for a couple $100. And also what it allows you to do is, without adding giant subs to your like TV system. So if you live in an apartment and you have neighbors, because anytime you added a subwoofer, you're going to get neighbors complaining. But if you add this to your couch, it doesn't vibrate. It'll vibrate your couch a little bit. Maybe your downstairs neighbors will complain a little bit, but it won't actually shake much, but it feels so bassy. And I remember I was at a friend's house and we were just listening to some like electronic music just at a party, and he had it in his couch, and I sat down and I was just like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. It sounded so bassy and so huge. So again, I wouldn't use it for a mixing type of a thing, but for this is pretty awesome. So, all right, let's see if we can find a Helmholtz resonant calculator right here. Just clicked on the first one. This is room dimensions. With that calculator. Width type port. Okay, yeah, so here we could do. So they're doing theirs as a square box. Do they do it as a circular box? But you can just type it in. So you can figure out the volume and the port area, and like you could just figure this out, and you can calculate how you want this thing to work. So pretty interesting. I need, like I said, I need to go through and do these myself. But all right, so why don't we stop there, because it's 12:15. So I'm talking a lot. I know I talk a lot in this class. I know there's so much, but this is cool stuff. Where this is really going to come to light is next week when we get into, I think it's next week. Maybe it's the week after. I can't remember. But when we're talking to room modes and low frequency stuff, that's when this stuff really starts to like dial in, and how we put this low frequency and absorption and all that kind of stuff to work for us. So with that, office hours are starting right now.